Yep.
Hi.
Morning.
Welcome. And what we'll do is start with a moment of prayer followed by the. Thank you.
Flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Please be advised that we do have a 3-minute rule for comments, and that the meeting is being recorded in aid of the minutes. And of course, you can always watch this on YouTube. Public comment on agenda items only. Seeing none. Jennifer, Penn State Cooperative Extension, an update. Welcome.
Good morning, commissioners. My name is Carol Mondock. I'm the Associate Director of Client Relations. I join you here from Penn State main campus. I lead the team of client relationship managers who oversee the relationships here in the county. And I'm pleased to introduce today Jennifer Mercereau, who's our newly appointed client relationship manager. She'll cover the Monroe County as one of her responsibilities with Penn State Extension. So we look forward to getting her connected. I did provide for you our quarterly highlights. They're there in front of you. Love the opportunity to review those with you during a work session coming up in first quarter. We'll do that periodically each quarter, and as well as convene with our County Extension Council here in Monroe County. We have some really dedicated people who help us promote our programs here in the county, help us advise of the needs of the county. And I talked to Bob earlier about potentially having a commissioner join us for those meetings quarterly so that we could hear from you as well on the current state of the county and making sure we're hitting the mark with some of the needs that are here in Monroe in particular. So we can leverage the expertise we have with 4-H, our master gardeners who do amazing work, as well as our master watershed stewards and our food families and communities educators. We focus on agriculture, but the well-being of the community as well. And so very excited about continuing this relationship and having Jennifer join the team to make sure that we get connected and stay connected here in the community. So thank you for the opportunity to introduce her this morning and then to share the highlights with you. We'll look forward to scheduling, working with Doreen on getting those quarterly meetings set up so that we can get some one-on-one time with you just to make sure we're hitting the mark.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Michelle,
Brummer.
adaptive resolution. Thank you.
Morning, commissioners and attendees to the meeting. I'm Michelle Brummer from Gannett Fleming. With me is Steve Knob, Penn State Cooperative Extension, starting something new. We're here to report something is complete. So a nice bookend. We prepared for you an adaptive reuse study at your request over the course of this year. This project focused on the old jail at 34 North 7th Street and the former assessor's office at 38 North 7th Street. And we're here to kind of give a bit of an overview of how we conducted this study and the findings that we came to it. We submitted a report toward the end of the summer. I have shared that report still with a draft marking on it to the stakeholders that we interviewed and then let them know about this meeting if they had any final comments to make. So we're here to present and we can finalize this later this month and get it back to you as complete. So our study purpose was to evaluate the condition of these two buildings, collect potential reuse ideas. If the county chooses to maintain ownership but use the building's lease or rent or something like that, what kind of activities or functions might happen here that would be compatible with the neighborhood, the community at large, and other goals the community and the region have. Other folks have those ideas, not us. We're here to help with sort of the feasibility of that, but also to look at among those ideas, which ideas work best, and what would be involved in making building improvements to support those desired outcomes. So quick overview of what we did. We toured the buildings last January. It was cold, even colder than today. But we toured the buildings and looked at the existing physical conditions for places that we could access. We didn't have 100% access, but we're certainly looking both at interior and exterior conditions. We reviewed the borough's ordinances relevant to land use, building improvement, sort of development conditions, because that provides a framework for what can be done, what is permitted, permissible today, and if something more unusual is needed, what might need to be requested. We did engage with the community, and we'll talk, I have a couple of slides on that in a few minutes. We identified a couple of actions that we think are essential, regardless of what happens with ownership and use, in terms of maintaining the buildings themselves. And we have heard before the meeting, some of that is building maintenance kinds of things are already moving in that direction. And finally, we looked at 3 ownership and use scenarios, outlined some steps, how you would move in that direction, kinds of improvements that would be needed, other related understanding that would need to be completed before real significant financial investment is made, as well as then some cost information. Next, please. Steve, you want to talk about our building conditions and the tour? Feel free to move as you need.
Yes. So Steve Knob, I'm an architect with Gannett Plumbing and brought in specifically to look at the conditions of the buildings. And so as described earlier, we had a day where we went and did a relatively comprehensive review of conditions at the buildings, primarily looking at future serviceability and accessibility depending on future use, change in use. So the findings were sort of what we expected for the most part, and the findings, so meaning, these buildings were not designed with accessibility. They predate 1991 accessibility standards, but they have potential to be made accessible, various functions. And importantly, we found that both buildings were in good serviceable condition. The jail, with no real evidence of settlement, some maintenance and repair work due as described, and the former assessor's office with sort of what we would expect as kind of normal settlement in a building like that. So neither building exhibiting cracking from settlement displacement that's uneven, just sort of stuff that's in an acceptable normal range. And so we've emphasized in the report certain maintenance and repair activities, as well as the needs to remove accessibility barriers, depending on the uses selected going forward.
Thanks. In terms of site conditions, our colleague Sean Rera was responsible for looking at several of these conditions. First, he looked at sort of, what's the parcel? There's one parcel, there's 2 buildings. If there might be different uses or different owners in the future, that would need to be addressed. You can certainly see the parking lot. You all are familiar, you work here. How that is used, does that become associated with one building or another? Were some things that we kind of wrestled with and included in our engagement questions. And the fact that there is no green space to this particular lot in an urban setting, not entirely unusual. There is green space within the recreation yard of the jail, but it's not part of sort of the character of the site. And we often see that in more modern sorts of regulations. So again, something we talked about with our engaged folks. Next. Sean looked at the zoning. If this property sits within C2 district of Stroudsburg Borough's zoning ordinance. So commercial uses are at play here generally, but there's also some retail uses allowed, some recreational, obviously some public and utility kinds of uses permitted. But that gives us a framework of, what else could happen both on this property and things around it, regardless of sort of public or private ownership. We did brainstorm a few additional uses, maybe that aren't permitted today, but might be useful if they were sort of at the edges of what the C2 allows, and tested those a little bit in our engagement. Next. We did ask about historic preservation. On our tour, we learned that the county had initiated a nomination for Courthouse Square District. for the National Register of Historic Places. And unfortunately, that stalled for reasons we don't know. So that hasn't been approved. The benefit of that recognition through the National Register is tax credits for building improvements that are consistent with that historic preservation. So there's a bit of an incentive for property owners. Not only are they being recognized, but an incentive to maintain that historic integrity to some extent. In addition, there is a historic district locally administered by Stroudsburg Borough, and that too provides some protection if it's administered and enforced in full. So this looks for properties to be maintained in terms of their exterior character, and that any changes or modifications are proposed and receive a certificate of appropriateness before they can move forward. That ordinance is as good as the implementation, the administration that Stroudsburg Borough brings to it. But given the otherwise historic character that we see, certainly there is a flavor and some visual styles that the community is already sort of preserving through private stewardship, but these tools provide some additional protections. Next. From these kind of technical findings that we had from our tour, observations, references to architectural accessibility standards, looking at zoning codes and so forth, we felt a poster that had some visual features would be a good way to begin to engage with stakeholders in the community at large. So we assembled this poster, thanks to Sean, and gave folks a little bit of a peek what the inside of the buildings look like, because chances are most people haven't been inside, but might be very curious. So we used this poster and its little QR code in the upper right-hand corner as a way to bring people into a public survey and ask them a couple of questions about these buildings, what they see these buildings used as, what needs they might fit or fulfill for the community, and what's their support for historic preservation, or is the parking lot somehow important to broader community events as a public space, not just a parking lot Monday or Friday kind of thing. So this poster was available in the courthouse while our survey was open. We shared it with our stakeholders going into sort of interview discussions kinds of things. So it was a nice, and we had it at the farmer's market the day that we were here in the spring, visiting with folks in person and asking, and how convenient it was to have the farmer's market be able to say, what do you think about those buildings right there? As opposed to so many public meetings I bet we've been to and we're like, okay, we're talking about a place we can't see, or, we have to think about where the address is. This was so handy. Next slide, please. As far as who we engaged, on the left-hand side, we had working with commissioners and the staff, identified folks who should be offered the opportunity to talk with us about preferences, needs they've heard, et cetera. So we talked with a number of folks from the borough. I think there were 7 folks on that call, representing officials and staff. The economic development business side was the EDC, the Chamber, the Downtown Business Association, and the Visitors Bureau. We had them as a group, and we spoke with the Historical Society in recognition of their awareness for these historic assets, and how it might fit into maybe their programming. We wanted to explore that a little bit, or how they felt they should fit into the overall historic preservation program in Monroe County. So our conversation with them was around this range of topics on the right, how could they be community development assets, serving housing and services and people sorts of needs, economic development opportunities, as well as that historic resource. Next, please. So the list on the left remains the same. The list on the right then, our findings from this. They certainly had a sense that however those buildings are used, it should complement downtown. The ongoing downtown improvement efforts that Stroudsburg is advancing, both economically and in terms of the community at large. There were a few suggestions for reuse, and you may see some repetition here in these uses that folks probably have already talked about, not only in their own heads, but among groups. Museum, some sort of tourist attraction because of the unique features, historic architecture that they have. Maybe a small business incubator, or some other civic or cultural space And they also mentioned, the second floor might operate a little differently in either of those buildings, but for a nonprofit community use. That was specifically for the old jail. Kind of similar things for the assessor's office, a little bit narrower. Museum could be a private business. It's less unique, still has architectural qualities, but doesn't have the unique jail function and design. And residential use. I mean, it looks like a house. So it could be repurposed as such. So those were things we chatted about with that group of stakeholders. Next. Here's more on the public survey and a photograph of our day out at the farmer's market and a little bit of chalk drawing to further draw attention to those buildings and why we outsiders were rubbing shoulders with locals shopping at the market. So this was kind of an in-person launch to the public survey, trying to get a little bit more awareness among just folks in person in terms of the survey and the county's willingness to hear what people's suggestions were. So this survey was open April through the middle of May. We promoted it by our presence at the farmer's market. A little image on the left was a kind of a quarter-page flyer that was available. I think here at the office, but I know Eric reported handing them out to some of the local businesses around the square. We handed them out at the farmer's market so that folks could take them home, share with a neighbor or a colleague. Our stakeholders helped us out. The borough put it on their website or shared it on their Facebook pages, some of the other folks. And from this, I think it was a really large response rate. I think it was over 400, if I remember correctly, in terms of folks who were looking at the information and giving comments and suggestions. 7 questions, so it wasn't terribly long. Some of them were checkbox kinds of things. Others were free form, tell us what you like. Next slide, please. What I did here, sorry, this one is all text, and we're going to get into more text in these last couple of slides. On the left is sort of primary results for the assessor's office, on the right for the old jail. This was kind of one of our checklist questions. Which of these uses would be appropriate? And folks could check more than one. So by checking, it was, yeah, this would be okay. This would be okay. I'm not checking that. That's not okay. I don't think that's good. And what we see is the top 5 for each of these buildings is the same. Some of that is context. Some of that is association with sort of the courthouse, county activities, county administration, sort of the design of this in its original form. But then there's some other options too. So on the assessor's office, the dwelling unit came up at the top, followed by museum, then restaurant, store, or business office. For the old jail, the museum certainly had a stronger first ranking, or more people checking that box. Restaurant, a bar coming in second, and then dwelling in combination, store and business. And then I listed some others that people checked frequently or were write-ins, and we do see some commonality there. Maybe because we were at the farmer's market and it was a cold day then too, they were interested in moving indoors. So that showed up on both lists. Maybe indoor market was sort of the same thing, maybe not necessarily farm-based, but otherwise. But cultural arts and history center, I mean, that came up in both lists. Art gallery isn't too terribly far from that. Community center. So I think people sort of see this block, seeing those buildings through some of the same eyes, but recognize there's a little bit of distinction between them. Next slide, please. So from at this point in our study, we sort of landed on these sort of 5 factors that we think folks are relatively in agreement about and should help us in our analysis of other ownership and use sort of scenarios. What should we really focus on? We did hear strong support for historic preservation. As we described it, the National Register, the Stroudsburg Historic District, we're not looking for nothing to change. Things need to be maintained, but that character to be sustained into the future and stewarded. Opportunity for economic development. There could be a place for business in here. Severability. These 2 buildings, while they share a lot today and may have both been built by the county in the mid-1800s, they don't necessarily have a historic function or current function that locks them together. They could be separated. And that was something that we looked at and may enable you to do different things with the buildings from an owner use perspective independently. Public access to a unique building, particularly the old jail, less so on the assessor side. Just that interest in, wow, that, it's old. what happened in there. I'd love to see the inside kind of stuff. There's sustained interest in that in our culture. What was, where we can still see things and structures. Stories are important, but sometimes the building is particularly important as well. And finally, a little bit about the parking lot. People weren't particularly interested in, any sort of major modification, expansion of those buildings. The parking lot was seen as important and felt they did support sort of other public activities at the square in downtown overall. So we wanted to keep those couple of factors in mind as we looked at the next couple of use scenarios. Next slide. And yeah, before we get to the use scenarios, here are the three recommendations that we made, regardless of what happens in terms of who owns or uses. This is how the county can sort of position for better purpose than what the buildings are being used for today and better stewardship. So nominate the Courthouse Square District to the National Register of Historic Places. On that graphic below there, I included the courthouse complex, the square, the little parklet at the center, and then the property that includes these two buildings. They were designed together, built together. They act as a unit, not necessarily as separate things, the way some other districts may have been constructed. Also outlined are the other parcels, and that's just outlined, not shaded, around the square. And they may be helpful to that district in terms of, they enclose that parklet space. So they do provide some spatial definition. Probably also built at the same time. We didn't investigate those quite as much, but that may be something to consider as well. And there was interest both in historic preservation, certainly for these buildings, but I think I sensed there was more around that. So I think it may be worthy to have a conversation with additional property owners and the potential benefits of tax credits if they are indeed interested. Recommendation number 2, regardless of ownership or use, is to subdivide that lot and separate the buildings. We believe there's space, as Sean has sketched out, in terms of creating 2 legal lots, so you're not creating a nonconformity that becomes a challenge to administer, but in fact could create a building envelope around the old jail so that you have enough access to maintain exteriors and do repair work, etc. And then align the majority of the parking lot with the assessor's office. The third final recommendation would be to stabilize and improve the accessibility of the old jail, remove barriers to some extent. Maybe you don't know quite yet what how much public access is needed, but ground floor is maybe a fair assumption. To start there. Earlier, there was a priority to address the roof, and I believe Bob Gress said that is in progress for next year, anticipated and has been budgeted. So, the roof provides that first protection against water. That certainly needs to be addressed. And then other things that just keep the building functioning and protect the structure of it from degradation and the potential for more costly repairs down the line. So regardless of what happens thereafter, this is sort of the baseline recommendations. Now we get to our ownership and use scenarios, labeled A, B, and C here. 1, or letter A, a county-owned museum and a tourism attraction. So this really leans into the idea that this is a unique building in terms of its design, its architecture. There are stories associated with it. We didn't detail those, but we know they are recorded elsewhere, and shortly there's rumors that are always made for good promotion as well. But we'll start with sort of those recorded and documented things. There is interest in seeing, like I said earlier, sort of the insides of these buildings, either as a sort of tour visit, but also as an environment for entertainment, whether that cafe sort of thing that might accompany a museum in some spaces. There are examples of this, 2 in Pennsylvania, 1 on sort of a similar scale in Jim Thorpe. Many folks in this part of the state are familiar with that. And then on a larger scale, the Eastern State Prison Museum down in Philadelphia is certainly much larger, but might give some great ideas for sort of programming events and promotion and so forth that would be worth a review. Scenario B would be a publicly owned incubator, maybe a makerspace and or shops. So something that's much more economic development, homegrown business, helping folks go from maybe an entrepreneur idea. I need to move out of my garage. I want to be more visible for our retail, or just an awareness sort of opportunity. And the jail space provides sort of that unitized divided space already in between, whether you're looking at the jail and its cell blocks with some better lighting and heating and so forth to make more comfortable. But even the building in the front part of the building where rooms could be operated separately. Scenario C then is kind of a hybrid of those two thoughts, because those were the ideas of greatest interest among the community. And we think they make sense, not that there aren't some hurdles to overcome, but perhaps in this scenario C, using the cell block as a museum, and maybe even what we call the stabilized ruin, where there isn't necessarily a lot of improvement made to it, but it just shares and makes visible what has been used in the past, and maybe accompanied by some interpretive kind of displays, but not necessarily heavy interpretation signboards or recorded histories, or even docent-led tours kinds of things. Maybe just, here's a building, here's a flyer, you can go look through it. But the front part then maybe has a little more commercial appeal for flex space. Next slide, please. So we have one slide on each of these scenarios. This comes right out of the executive summary, kind of a highlights list here. So under A, the county-owned museum and tourism attraction, the county would retain ownership of the old jail. You would need to engage a museum operator to help with developing the program for that museum and determining what level of other improvements might be needed within, both improvements to the building as well as the interpretation modes, again, signboards, spoken tours, recordings, etc. And special events, whether, what kinds of things are permitted and what might be beyond the line, and sort of defining those parameters. And that would be something museum experts could help with in making those decisions. There are some costs outlined on the right-hand side. This one, over $200,000. And sort of basic building stabilization, that recommendation number 3 was just over $40,000 as an estimate. And then we allotted some funding for those sort of other improvements. And this, we think, could be accomplished within 2 to 3 years. Next, scenario B, publicly owned incubator. We said publicly owned. This could remain in county hands if you wished, or this could be arranged for transfer to another public entity. But we do think the public ownership does make sense in terms of maybe eligibility for some other technical and funding assistance, as well as a management of this space and many other vendors' spaces within. We do think this needs some additional market analysis. We weren't tasked to look at that, incubator, co-working space. How much demand is there for that in the Pocono region? Are there specific types of co-working space that folks are interested in, be it high tech or other, but that might give you some information about building needs and resource needs to bring that to fruition. There would need to be a management entity involved, whether that be a part of a county staff position or a separate entity, to determine how that can best work and meet needs that you might find in a market analysis. And then decide really how does that ownership structure, what makes sense. Here we outline county retaining the ownership, selling it to a management entity, maybe that's a possibility, or an option to transfer it into the borough. Costs are outlined on the right. This one we estimated at over $1 million. Again, starting with that baseline building stabilization, some funding for that market analysis, and then about $1 million for sort of the building rehab, improvement, redevelopment as needed. This has a longer timeline of 3 to 6 years. Next. C. So hybrid museum and flex space. As you can imagine, these are somewhat a combination of what was presented on slides for A and B. Again, that sort of market analysis to inform how this might best fit economically, and how much demand there is for a use, and how that might help you with that hybrid component of how much doing what function in terms of museum and museum associated spaces or footprint, and what is perhaps best put into the flex space arena. Again, use of a management agency, some subletting might be involved here. And the costs here on the right, this is in fact the lowest cost estimate, I think. Sorry, I forgot my numbers already. $135,000. Again, that baseline building stabilization, some market analysis. This might be a little less, or similar magnitude, but and then finally some very basic building repairs, certainly until things are further decided. Ultimately bringing this into full function and at about the same timeline. Our last slide is kind of a conclusion that we do think, based on our research and the engagement with the community, that these buildings certainly could be put to better use, both economically in terms of community fabric, services, and so forth, regardless of the use that may be selected. The determination of those uses may take some additional time, given market analysis needs, unless there's a particular interest the county or is willing to invest in, but we think a market analysis would be useful. Finally, again, just those three basic recommendations for the National Register, the separation of the two buildings and sale of the assessor's office, if I didn't speak that earlier, into a private ownership, and then building stabilization for the jail. I think that is certainly things that can start. It sounds like have already been considered in order to protect the interests for the next steps that you make. So we're happy to have any discussion or answer some questions, give clarification if needed. But that work is completed and we can finalize the
Really,
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to say is there are some visitors here. Do you want me to just show which one is the jail, and which one's the assessors?
You're welcome. Sure.
That's the old teacher in the sorry. This is the jail. This is the assessor's building. So.
And while they look similar in the front due to their brick facade, white framed windows, they're very different on the inside.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned incentives for historic preservation, but I wonder, will that prevent those buildings from actually being accessible, or are there incentives to maintaining historic preservation, but also creating accessibility?
Can you speak to that? Sort of how you balance historic preservation and accessibility?
Yes, so there sometimes is tension there, but the idea of preservation is not to maintain conditions that are inaccessible necessarily. What we would want to do, for instance, is like avoid putting a ramp or a lift on the primary facade. We would want to, be diligent to do good preservation there, including things like, part of what we looked at in the budgeting is getting new doors to the front of the jail that are more appropriate. Right now, there's something that's a replacement door there that's just doesn't really make sense. And that we would achieve accessibility probably on that driveway side between the two buildings. So there is a little tension there, but it's not a major barrier. The intent is to keep buildings usable while doing our best to preserve their heritage.
And the building codes that are in place are kind of a leveled effect in terms of where do you truly need full accessibility and where is it not essential for the public? And maybe we don't need accessibility to the second floor, but you need it for.
It gets complicated, depending on the use group, right? The degree of accessibility, what you're using the building as, its size would inform whether a certain use would require an elevator, for instance. Some uses you wouldn't have to really improve things much at all. And the international existing building code does have a section for historic properties to essentially lessen the standards that are applied. That's sufficient? Do you have any follow-on?
No, I think it's good. I do have another question though. our county is facing an affordable housing crisis, as is the rest of the state, and I only saw affordable housing mentioned on there once, so I was curious what kind of feedback you got from the community on the survey about that.
Yeah, so it was something that was mentioned either in the write-in or checkbox, just to make our top 5. So there is clear, we did hear about that need. And I certainly don't disregard that need, whether this is the right place for that.
Thanks for much feedback for it. It was kind of like.
It was mentioned as this is a need in our community. Could these be used for this? And in order to use this site for affordable housing and really have any sort of impact on the need that's here, I imagine would be a much more drastic change to these.
But most of the feedback was about the other.
Yes.
The other option.
Yes, because there was an interest in maintaining the buildings as they are and trying to put them to a best function that serves the community.
Yeah. Just really quickly, the idea that the former assessor's office would likely be sold off means that it's going to respond to market demand, which could certainly be housing.
I have a question. A couple questions, if I can. First of all, what's the square footage of the building? You know?
I don't
have it up. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
And is there a tie-in, and you may have said this, but is there a tie-in to the Historical Society and the project that's going on? And
No, there is not a connection between this and we talked to the director of the Historic Society. Their building was still under construction and renovation. We're coming to Tennessee if that's been completed or not. Yeah, they have no ownership stake in this. I think they are, from the history of the jail, it's a place where people were kept in the county years ago. There's that sort of story side of history. They are interested. And the structure that remains. I didn't hear her say, "Oh, well, I'd like to have it." She wasn't coming forward. We were seeking her opinion, so we weren't working against part of the intents of theirs. Yeah.
It was very well politically stated. Yeah. You did a very good job.
Amy, would you like to step in on it? What your thoughts were?
We think it's a wonderful site for the dam. And the question was, can you just absorb it? Not right now, but with further discussion and talking with our board and things like that, a museum is certainly very intriguing to us.
Not off the table. Not off the table.
On the preservation side, we have made the National Park Service recommendation, which would add standards to how these are preserved long term.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
we agree on that.
And I'll just add, I mean, just, that spot, the square, is just such a special place, right? I mean, I remember when I was a kid and at Strasburg High School, we would have band concerts in the courthouse square before there were concerts in the.
There's another description for the nomination. It should be included.
And I mean, that was partly due to Ralph Harrison. I remember playing timpani where the timpanis were straddled around the cannons.
Okay.
And it was just a big event. But I think that area, it's one of those, if you build it, they will come. And, as Eric Boomer has seen, if y'all weren't at the Christmas tree lighting ceremony on Friday, there must have been, it's got to be a couple thousand, 2,000, 2,500. And we've seen this time and time again where, we bring concerts in, we bring stuff, especially for the younger folks. And of course, everybody seems to look younger these days. If you build it, they will come. So, when you look at it, I love the idea of multi-use. I love the idea of museum, co-working space. We don't have a co-working space, and the amount of people that we have commuting back and forth to New York, Philadelphia, Allentown, that work in their garage 3-4 days a week, that want to get away from that washer and dryer place. They just do. I don't know what the number is, but, you know, I think that a lot of those suggestions are great, but to have it be part of the charm and to bring people in and create additional revenue, not only for private, but the county as well. That's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you.
We have a comment online from Sean.
Okay. Sean Rara, our colleague, who wasn't able to make the travel time for us this morning, but I did ask if he was available. Sean, what do you want to add to our conversation?
Hi, everybody. Sorry. Yeah, just wanted to point out that the assessor's office is roughly 2,400 square feet. So if you're talking in terms of housing, you know, really you're looking at maximum of 4 units, and those are not big units. And then the jail is a little over 6,000 square feet. You know, it did house at least 8 people there, and then one up front. So, you know, that there's housing of a sort there. But obviously that building would need a lot of remedy to become any kind of real housing units, and expensive remedies too, because it is a big masonry building built to last. Just to point that out. And I think Michelle mentioned this too, just to point out the historic preservation. I don't know who did it. We can't find exactly who put it forward. I think it was the county, though, back in the day, had pushed for a county courthouse National Register district. And it went as far as being accepted by the SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, as like most likely eligible, but needed a little additional work. And then for whatever reason, it just stopped. The push for it stopped. So all that research is available. It wouldn't take much to do that. And National Register doesn't mean you have to do anything with the building, unless there's federal or state money involved. But it does open you up to federal and state money being made available to do these kind of things. Whereas if it's not on the register, there's there's one more list of grants that you can't access. So, thanks, sir.
We did go through that with the renovation of the historic courthouse, and the fact that we didn't take any federal funding made it allowable
Okay.
to renovate.
One must weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah, if I could just throw my 2 cents on this. Eric's here in 11:30. Good morning. I think this is a great idea, and I think just in the future it should be all hands on deck. I think it seems like it's going in the direction of a museum. That's really good. If so, my office we have tons of, call them relics, but old uniform patches, etc. So I'm going to start doing my own research, talking to former Sheriff Todd Martin, etc. I think maybe like mannequins of old uniforms and stuff for the old days would be good. But yeah, this is great. Whenever the meetings are, let me know. I'm on board.
Well, thank you. Anything else, anybody? Yes?
Is this published yet or not yet?
It is still in draft with the planning office, but we will submit the final and get it to you by the end of next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, moving on for the more exciting presentations. Approval of the minutes of the 11/20/24 Commissioners meeting. Is there a motion, please? Second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Approve the minutes of the 11/27 Commissioners meeting. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Amend motion 24-145 dated 5/1/24, reflecting the revised Title 4E 2324 reimbursement reports. First quarter to $313.46, and the second quarter to $363.01. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Amend motion 24 2024-264 dated 8/21/24, reflecting revised Title 4E 2324 reimbursement report for the third quarter to $423.03. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. Proclamations and certificates. Logan Decker, Eagle Scout. I was able to participate in that, and I have to say it was quite a event when there was Troop 86 had 25 Eagles present. That was quite an event. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. New business personnel. And we have the personnel with the agenda and approve and ratify requests for additional work hours in the sheriff's office. Is there a motion, please? So moved.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. We have electronic transfers for vouchers payable, gross payroll, healthcare benefits, dental claims, and flexible spending. Is there a motion, please?
Second.
First and second, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. Travel authorization, approve, ratify the travel request for the Conservation District, and evidently the Planning Commission is on the road. Is there a motion, please? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion, children and youth, approve the following purchase service agreements for the period of 7/1/24 through 6/30/25 with Northampton Youth Detention Center, in total of $880,000, including a 3-bed hold beginning on 12/1/24. That's secure detention for male and female. Pinebrook Family Answers, totaling $30,000 for intensive medical foster care. Pence Run Youth Services, totaling $145,000 for emergency shelter, group home, and transitional living services, and approve the submission of the 23-24 fourth quarter Title 4E juvenile probation claim report for federal reimbursement of administrative costs in the amount of $98.58. Is there a motion?
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. Commissioners report, ratify the budget adjustment report dated 12/2/24, $50. Evidently, jury management purchased a refrigerator for $50. Approve the budget adjustment report dated 11/27, totaling $160,929. The commissioners moved $470 for dam inspections, a correctional facility at $10,000 for uniforms, and also for labor relations of $25,000 for the correctional facility, as well as $60,000. It was moved out of medical and prison boarding for medical contingency. We also had $39,000 for the MDJ courts for interpreter fees. They took money out of their contracted services and civil fines to pay that. The MDJ courts also took $100 out of record disposal to cover subscriptions. The district attorney is asking for $10,000 for transport prisoners. They're taking their money out of wages and salaries. Domestic relations is $4,500 for support masters to cover an increase in appeals and complexity of cases. They're taking that money out of wages and salaries. Domestic relations, $3,000 to cover additional office supply forms to cover the end of the year invoices. We also have an emergency management, $5,659 to cover their cost of training. Evidently, they have to purchase an upgrade to their training services, and that covers that cost. And also in maintenance for another $2,000 for expenses in the common areas, paint and supplies. They took that money out of housekeeping paper supplies. And the register recorder is $1,200 to cover for advertising. They're looking to cover purchases for upcoming expos for the next year. We also have to ratify change order EC 102 with Wind Gap Electric totaling $21,550.66. The removal of existing data and low voltage and rewiring old street lighting and controls into the new system. Approve the 2025 tax bill dates for the county and township interim run B school bills and interim run A. 26 as listed in the attachment dated 11/21/24. Authorize the chief clerk to advertise the following: the 2025 meeting schedule and county holidays, the LERTA proposal for the Stroudsburg Borough, paving and parking lot in the Monroe County parking deck entrance and exit, special meeting to consider establishment of salaries for county row offices and tax collectors for the period of 2006 through 2029. 2026 to 2029. Add the following vendors to the county list of approved vendors: DSI International for Office of Emergency Management and Linda Josie for the Area Agency on Aging. And finally, to approve the emergency repair quote for MCCF in the amount of $5,088.46 to replace the water meter and cable. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second, any questions? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Conservation District, reappoint Commissioner Sharon Labrador to the County Commissioner appointee to the one-year term of 1/1/25 through 12/31 of 25. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second? I'll second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Same.
You can. Motion carries. Correctional Facility, ratify addendum of Oasis Management System for the period of 1/1/25 through 12/31/25 to keep or decrease prices with the commission rate of 35%. And also to ratify the agreement of professional service with Justice Benefits, Inc. for assistance in obtaining and receiving new revenue for federal, state, and other revenue sources for the period of 11/21/24 through 11/21/26. Is there a motion, please?
Okay.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Ratify application for the purchase of equipment to the State Food Purchase Program in the amount of $2,229 for a two-door freezer for the Salvation Army. Authorize Kwanzaa Smith grant managers to electronically sign the fiscal year 25-27 Stop Violence Against Women grant contract for the period of 1/1/25 through 12/31/25, totaling $125,000. Ratify submittal of revised fiscal year Continuum of Care Program grant agreement with a new contract period of 1/1/25 through 12/31/25. Contract remains the same at $277,017. And execute a grant agreement with the PA Emergency Management totaling $4,080,902.02 for interconnection project award for the statewide connectivity funds. That's a pass-through to the 911 center. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second, any questions? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Information Services, approve statement of work for Commercial Pro Services for Trackit training services for the amount of $480. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. In the Municipal Waste Authority, acknowledge the receipt of the final 2025 non-substantial plan revision DEP approved. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Computer Capital, ratify approval of computer capital purchases report dated 12/4/24 totaling $13,362.93.
So moved. It was.
I'm sorry, I'll change it. $13,662.92. Is that correct?
It's just capital purchase approval, not computer capital purchase approval. Correct.
Oh, okay. So that was a miss.
Oh, I'm sorry, because it's a tailgate spreader for the correctional facility, and emergency management gets a brand new pressure washer. Thank you.
So with those.
So it's just capital purchase.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we'll make that capital purchases. Is there a motion, please?
With the corrections, yes.
Second, all in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye, motion carries. Is there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to thank the board for reappointing me to the Conservation District. I really enjoy it. It's an honor to work with that group of folks. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Is there anything else? Is there a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
We are, thank you. We have election board in 4 minutes. Okay, then assessment board at 1:30. Thank you for coming. Thanks for hanging out.